Thanks for coming, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Tonight's meeting is sponsored by Vermont Tempest Collective, and I want to just say a few words about the collective before we begin. We're part of a national organizing and educational project. We organize public forums and events to educate, discuss, and engage with struggles in unions and other workers' organizations around housing rights, climate and racial justice, bodily autonomy and gender liberation, and movements against the threat from the far right, and for internationalist solidarity with Palestine and other struggles. Tonight's forum is called Don't Mourn, Organize, Building the Resistance to Trump's Regime. And we've brought together a wonderful range of Vermont activists to discuss the threat posed by the incoming regime. And we're here really to discuss the threat, how to unite against it, and how to build a resistance. So each of our speakers will speak for around 6 minutes to share their thoughts, and then we'll open up for general discussion where people are free not only to ask questions, but to make suggestions and to have a genuine discussion. We will close between 7:30 and 8. We have to be out of the room by 8, so we'll definitely be out of here by then. But hopefully we'll plan to finish formally a little bit before that so that people have time to circulate informally before we leave at 8. So I'm going to introduce all of our speakers in the order that they will be presenting, and then I won't reintroduce each one separately just to save time for efficiency. So our first speaker will be Ashley Smith, who's from the Tempest Collective. Then we'll hear from Will Lambek, who's from Migrant Justice. Next we'll hear from Nolan Rampey of the Howard Center, AFSCME 1674. Then we'll hear from Phoebe Zorn, who's a queer community leader. Then Jonathan Elwell from Free Her, Vermont, followed by our last speaker, Samia Abbas from Southern Vermont for Palestine. I'm also going to be sending around a sign-up sheet for people who are interested in learning more about Tempest Collective and if you want to be on our mailing list for future events. So that will be coming around. All right, so up to our first speaker, Ashley Smith.
All right, everybody. Brothers, sisters, siblings, comrades, all, we have a wolf coming at the door, and we need to be prepared for this. Trump is a clear and present danger to every one of us in this society and around the world. He's coming in with a far-right government already in a box, and he is preparing a frontal assault on our fundamental democratic rights and a massive attack on oppressed groups and the entire working class. Most working people will be damaged by what Trump is bringing. And the return of Donald Trump to power is entirely the fault of the Democratic Party. Their promises of reform and improvement in working class people's lives have failed us over the last four years. So even before Biden's onset of senility, he was headed for defeat by Donald Trump. His militarism abroad, especially the genocide in Palestine, alienated an entire generation of young people. And the austerity measures that Biden oversaw in the last 3 years, after the initial rush of reforms petered out, and instead each one got repealed, that addressed people's real economic grievances, people have suffered a tremendous setback in their standard of living, mainly as a result of inflation, which is a systemic problem to capitalism in our epoch. So even before Biden went down and Harris was brought in a palace coup, the Democrats were headed for defeat. And to be honest, Harris ran a right-wing, anti-woke, militarist campaign that offered little to nothing to working class people in our society. She defended the genocide. She toured with Liz Cheney, who's an arch right-wing enemy of working class people all around the world. She ran as the establishment defense of the status quo. That is the least appealing electoral message you could possibly come up with. So unsurprisingly, her vote totals dropped by 7 million votes overall, and she lost in the key battleground states. And I think we have to be clear that Trump didn't win running away with this election. He didn't get over 50% of the vote. He barely won in the battleground states. The reality is that he only got 33% of the electorate to vote for him, because the turnout was around 66%, so divided between the two of them, it was basically 33% to 33%. So Trump does not have the support of the vast majority of working class people here in this country, nor did he really increase his vote totals among white people. His biggest increase in vote totals was from Latinos on an economic populist message and an anti-immigrant message. So Trump is not coming in with a giant new coalition that has got the support of the majority of people. In fact, he's coming in as a weak government, but a vicious government that has a plan. And nobody should underestimate the threat Trump proposes. This is not a rerun of 2016. This is a far more dangerous administration coming into office. Last time, he didn't have a program, didn't have a cabinet, and didn't have a plan. This time, he has all those three. He has Project 2025, which is the most detailed right-wing fantasy program for domestic and international politics you can imagine. He already has a cabinet appointees of loyal, far-right lackeys and billionaires that want to carry out an assault on programs that we hold dear to our hearts. And he has a plan to execute these points of his agenda once he gets into office, and he's going to hit us like a ton of bricks in January. So people should be prepared for the onslaught. What he's going to do is do what the right has always done, and that is carry out a strategy of divide and conquer, to pit people against one another, to give everything away to the rich in our society. So it's already clear his plan. Target oppressed groups while he carries out, frankly, a class war against the majority of people in this country. He's offering tax cuts for the rich, massive deregulation, abolition of whole departments like the Department of Education that he's appointed Linda McMahon, a CEO from professional wrestling, to head the education department of the US government. And he wants to weaponize the FBI and the rest of the security forces in the United States against a list of enemies that includes Palestine solidarity activists who have been the key struggle over the last year in opposition to our government and to its policies, both domestic and international. And he's threatened to deploy the military against protests here in this country. His first targets are very clear: migrants, trans people, queer people more broadly, people of color, in particular black people, and Palestinians and Palestine solidarity activists. Those are the first people he's coming to target. But behind that, he's going to carry out a massive war on public sector workers. They want to, through the department, DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency. It's a division, or whatever it is. It's named after a cryptocurrency. So DOGE has a plan to abolish whole sections of the government, lay off tens of thousands of public sector workers, and subject them to efficiency requirements. So this is a huge attack on federal workers and state workers in general that will trickle across throughout the United States. But we should be clear, Trump is going to overreach. He does not have the mandate he thinks he has. So when he goes on the attack, he's going to trigger resistance. That's an inevitable fact of the situation we're headed into. Our task is to be politically prepared and far better organized this time to mount a counteroffensive against the incoming regime. And we should have hope that we can defend ourselves and also win things even under this right-wing government. If you doubt that, just look at what's going on in South Korea, where a right-wing, homophobic, reactionary, without popular support, tried to declare martial law, and the people of South Korea rose up in the millions went on strike, barricaded the parliament, and forced him to withdraw his threat of deploying martial law in the society. And now there's an ongoing general strike throughout South Korea to stop this government, impeach it, and get rid of it. So the key thing in building our resistance is to learn from the mistakes that we made in the last resistance. The first and biggest problem is our resistance went into the Democratic Party with an electoral hope that we could stop the right by voting in Democrats. That has failed. We've got now Trump back in office precisely because of people's disappointment in the Democratic Party. The second lesson we have to learn is that we didn't build mass democratic organizations in the resistance for people to get involved, take ownership over the struggle, and decide democratically its future projects. As a result, when the Democrats got all the attention, we didn't have anything left. And so for the last 4 years, most all of the activist movements have gone to sleep, gotten demobilized, and suffered huge setbacks. Just think about the climate struggle as one example. The U.S. is fracking and drilling more oil in its history under Biden than at any time in the history of this country. So finally, we have to start a discussion of how we organize and build our much more militant struggle. If we want to do what people have done in South Korea, we're nowhere near that yet. But we have to get our act together in local organization, in the trade unions. People have to start, especially in the public sector, imagining out-of-contract strikes to defend jobs. Because you can't wait 3 years, 4 years. Your job is going to be gone. So that means breaking the law and going on strike to defend jobs now. And so people have to start thinking about more militant tactics. I'll just end with this point. We also have to start a discussion about how to build an alternative party to these two parties. Because we've got a capitalist establishment party in the Democratic Party, and we've got a far-right capitalist party in the GOP. Neither of those offer an alternative to the vast majority of people in this country. So we have to start a discussion inside the movement itself about how we launch a new workers' party, a labor party, whatever we want to call it, that's an alternative mainly in the streets and in workplaces to organize people where we have power, which is there, but also to run candidates. We do not have any party of that sort yet. That has to be built out of this resistance, because either we do that or we really face barbarism. We've seen barbarism in Palestine. They have decimated Gaza, committed a genocide. That's what is being bred all over the world. So we have to start building an alternative that is going to fight for a different kind of society that puts people before profit and wins a whole new democratic world where we can live in peace and justice.
All right, thank you so much, Ashley. Put on a little timer here. 6 minutes, huh?
Self-timing.
Will's far more disciplined than I am.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Will Lambek. I'm here representing the organization Migrant Justice, Justicia Migrante. Apologies at the outset. You're supposed to be hearing from Rossy Alfaro tonight. She had a family emergency and wasn't able to make it. I was here as the interpreter, so I'm going to take over. I don't have any prepared remarks, but this is a topic of conversation that we've been well enmeshed in over the past couple weeks. So hopefully I can put together a couple thoughts. First, just a show of hands, who's heard of Migrant Justice or participated in a Migrant Justice action? Great. Good to see y'all again. So as pertains to the election, echoing what Ashley said, there was not a pro-immigrant candidate from a major party on the ballot. Had Harris won the election, it would have been a rightward shift in immigration politics in this country. The primary talking point of the Democrats, not only about immigration, but really of the Democrats in the election, was that Trump tanked the bipartisan border bill. We heard that ad nauseum. Translate that to the Democrats tried to gut asylum, and then they used this political maneuver as hay in the elections. So we were not looking at any positive movement regarding immigrant rights in the election. From migrant justice perspective, we're very clear that there's been a bipartisan consensus about the politics of racialized exclusion of immigrants, criminalization of immigrants, mass detention and deportation of immigrants in this country. The re-election of Trump will signify a real difference, but it's a difference in degree, not in kind. That doesn't mean it's not an important difference. So what does it mean for the undocumented immigrant community in Vermont, immigrant farm workers in particular? In the first Trump administration, we saw a real increase in the presence of ICE and Border Patrol in the state, increasing what has always happened, which is racial profiling of people as they're driving to the grocery store or to the pharmacy or taking their kids to the park or going to the health clinic for a dentist appointment. People are regularly profiled, pulled over, detained, and then put in removal proceedings. This accelerated under the Trump administration, and in addition to those patterns of immigration enforcement, we saw a particular targeting of community leaders and of migrant justice as an organization. Over the first couple of years of the Trump administration, 20 immigrant leaders in Vermont were detained and put in deportation proceedings. ICE began to surveil migrant justice physically and electronically, including through the use of confidential informants, and began a disinformation campaign to sow distrust in the community as a way of breaking the community's spirit to organize. This was ultimately unsuccessful. Migrant justice and many of you in this room mobilized resistance, and through litigation were able to stop ICE's targeting of immigrant community leaders and migrant justice as an organization and win reprieve from deportation for the plaintiffs in that lawsuit, as well as compensation. This was a huge victory for immigrant rights in the state and nationally, and set the groundwork for much of Biden's early immigration policy. So we are very concerned about the return of targeting to the organization as ICE in Vermont and around the country seeks to go after community leaders and human rights defenders. What does this mean for organizing resistance and solidarity with immigrants in Vermont? We will be building infrastructure of rapid response networks around the state so that when people are pulled over by Border Patrol, when ICE shows up at somebody's house, we can mobilize quickly to arrive, observe, document, and intervene in those enforcement actions to protect our neighbors and reduce the chance of people being arrested and put in deportation proceedings. We will also be mobilizing to defend Vermont's fair and impartial policing policies. Migrant justice has led the fight over the past decade plus to ensure that Vermont cops are not in the business of deportation. In 2017, the state elected officials and law enforcement officers watered down the policy under threats from the Trump administration and opened new loopholes allowing cops to begin to share information with ICE and Border Patrol. We know that these threats are going to come again, and Vermont's elected officials need to show more backbone this time around to ensure that we're defending those policies, and that won't happen on its own. It will happen when we mobilize to force them to defend those policies and make sure that ICE and Border Patrol are denied that force multiplier of law enforcement agencies locally at the county and state level, because there's no way for the Trump administration to enact its promises of deportations in the millions or tens of millions without the collaboration of law enforcement agencies. Let's make sure that can't happen in the state of Vermont. And finally, we need to be mobilizing to continue to support dairy workers organizing for labor rights on the farm. Anti-immigrant policies are not about expulsion at the end of the day. They are about labor exploitation. The reason why the likes of Trump make these threats is to ensure that there is a permanent underclass of workers who are so precarious and so at risk, denied so many rights, that they will accept abuse and accept labor conditions that no other worker would. That is the point of this, and so we can't forget that organizing for labor rights is immigrant resistance to Trump's attacks on immigrant rights. So continue to show up for Milk with Dignity, continue to show up for workers in the State House, on the farm, at company headquarters, as we fight for a dairy industry that puts workers first. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. You'll have to forgive me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold right now. Yeah, so my name's Nolan Rampy. I'm the vice president of AFSCME 1674, which is at the union at Howard Center. I wanted to talk a little bit about the labor perspective in terms of building this fight back against Trump. I think, from what Ashley and Will and everyone else has laid out right now, one of the things that's clear is that it can feel a little bit overwhelming because the attacks that Trump and his administration are putting together right now are really feeling like they are going to be coming from all sides, right? As Ashley mentioned, Project 2025 is like this 1,000-page document of every conservative's dream of what they want to do and remake society in every way possible. So we are needing to gear up for attacks on the LGBTQ plus community. We are, needing to gear up for attacks on abortion rights. We are needing to gear up for attacks on migrants. We are needing to gear up for attacks on the gutting of, public sector, across the board. And it can feel overwhelming. And I think, that's where I want to talk about the importance that labor is going to play in this, because in many ways, I think that there's really, a couple of really important ways in which labor can be a focal point in this. And one is that labor is going to be the intersection of so many of these struggles, because LGBTQ plus people are largely members of the working class. People of color are largely members of the working class, right? Migrants are members of the working class. And, even though the dairy farm workers aren't able to have a union, they play a pivotal role in the network of labor that makes this country go round. And so when we are seeing all these attacks and feeling as though they are coming in disparate directions, it can be really helpful to have a point of struggle at which many of these attacks are going to intersect. And that place is at our workplace, right? And so organizing together, if you're in a union, organizing to strengthen that union. If you are not in a union, either organizing to build a union or even just talking with your coworkers, right? Building that solidarity and figuring out what is going on with people, because we are all going to need to be ready to fight back. And so that's the first point, is around the fact that I think at the work site, where we are all working together, is a point where many of these struggles are going to be intersecting and coming to a head. And then secondly, it is at the place of work where I think we have our real power, right? That is where we can really flex our muscle in our ability to withhold our labor and engage in collective action. I think that we have all, everyone here has almost certainly been to protests that can be incredibly inspiring, right? That to see how many people are engaged in a particular struggle, but we go and we yell and we make our voices heard, and then we go home, and it's like, okay, where was the inflection point that allowed us to actually force the government's hand to do something, right? Where was the power, right? Because all the politicians can go, let us have our little marches, give us our permits, and say, okay, great, I'm glad you all were able to blow off some steam, now go home, right? So where does the power lie in that? And that is in bringing that struggle into our workplace, right? In withholding our labor and being able to actually flex our muscle and actually cost the capitalists, cost the bosses some money, and force them to actually pay attention to what we are doing. I think that, Ashley, made a really great point about what happened in South Korea, right? With the announcement of, this attempt at basically a coup, this declaration of martial law, labor unions all around that country declared a general strike and are still on general strike until that leader steps down, right? That is the power of labor. And I could be here all night talking about other examples of the way that labor and going on strike can be that tipping point. Now, as Ashley mentioned, we're still a long way from that in terms of being able to do what South Korea did. But I do want to make one final point in the little bit of time that I have and go to an example here back in 2016, and that was the Red State Teachers Revolt that happened. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but there were states that voted for Trump around the country, and it started in West Virginia, where teachers and educators were being starved for resources, being denied pay and benefits. And they went on an illegal wildcat strike, shut the school systems down, and demanded and forced the legislature to go back into an emergency session to then allocate more resources to give the teachers what they wanted and get them back to work. That is the type of power that labor had, and that's the type of thing that we need to have our eye on in terms of what we can do. And just the very last thing that I'll say with that is that it gives a hint, it gives a glimpse of what our power can be when we are organized within the workplace. But then that Red State Teachers Revolt, the reason it was called Red State was because those states voted for Trump, right? It has the ability to clarify where the lines of disagreement, where the two sides are, in a way that the Democrats are completely incapable of doing, right? When it comes to which side are you on, who is fighting for the rights of immigrants, who is fighting for workers' rights, labor can do that in a way that Democrats cannot, because they are bought and paid for by the capitalist class in the exact same way that the Republicans are. So I really am going to look forward to seeing labor's ability to be a part of all of these struggles that we are talking about here and that we're going to be seeing in the future. So thank you. Solidarity, everyone.
Hi there, my name is Phoebe Zorn. I'm the director of a statewide queer org based here in Chittenden County. My pronouns are she, her. I'm honored to be here alongside such powerful and experienced organizers, and really grateful for the Vermont Tempest Collective for bringing us together. So as I was thinking about tonight's discussion, I kept coming back to this idea that we need to continue doing the same work that we have been doing, but more so. So I've been conceptualizing our work as a queer organization post and even pre-election as two parallel and sometimes overlapping tracks. So the first one is working within the structures that exist. So we're doing things like helping people change their names and gender markers on IDs and passports, working with legislators, state officials, and legal professionals to increase protections for trans and queer folks, and finding creative ways as a nonprofit to use grant funds while we still have them, to support that kind of work and the people who are doing it however we can. The second track being organizing to build power and solidarity against those same structures, and the white supremacist, capitalist powers that govern our existence from the federal level all the way down to the individual and interpersonal. So as a queer person and a working class person, I know that the state has never existed to serve or protect me. Queer people in America have always had to navigate within a system that isn't for us, and this is even more true for trans and queer people of color, who live in a country designed from the start to marginalize, other, and control them, as well as profit from their labor, cultures, and very bodies. There are obviously going to be even more direct and escalating threats under Trump's administration than we've had to deal with in the last 4 years, and we need to be strategizing and organizing now about what might happen and how we're going to fight back, but this fight isn't new. Because trans and queer people have always had to fight for a right to exist, we have a rich history to learn from, and one of the clearest lessons from our history is the importance of solidarity. Solidarity within the queer community, solidarity between marginalized communities, and solidarity across movements. So especially vital right now for building solidarity is those under less threat, speaking up and standing with those facing more immediate and dire threats. As a white, cis, able-bodied person, a US citizen, and someone who's straight-passing in some contexts, I have more access to power and safety than many others in my community or other communities that are being immediately and directly threatened by the incoming administration. So I can and will use that power in a wide range of ways to help protect and uplift those who don't have the same privileges. This ranges from using my positional power to speak up, like at this event, or when I led my organization to publicly reject a large yearly sponsorship from Hannaford in solidarity with Migrant campaign. to platforming and uplifting people doing aligned organizing work, like inviting the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation to lead the Pride Parade and speak at Pride this year. And of course, engaging in quieter behind-the-scenes organizational and collective power-building work. And most importantly, following the lead and learning from seasoned organizers with lived experiences. So with all of that in mind, I also want to talk briefly about not letting the justifiable and valid fears of what Trump's administration might bring for trans, queer, and all historically marginalized people push us into undue urgency or panic. I've been revisiting a lot lately Dr. Tema Akun's teachings about urgency as a characteristic of white supremacy. And yes, there are imminent threats and time-sensitive work to do, but we can't do our best work when our nervous systems are highly activated. As Dr. Akun teaches, working under a sense of urgency makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive and equitable, make thoughtful decisions, and to think and act long-term. And as other folks have already touched on, that long-term work is what we need to be doing now. And the failure of that long-term work is a lot of what led us here today. It also makes it harder for us to distinguish what is really urgent from what feels urgent. After a while, everything takes on the same sense of urgency, which leads to burnout, exhaustion, poor decision-making. So while the incoming federal administration feels and is truly threatening, I want to remind us all as individuals, organizers, and movement leaders to not let fear control us. This brings me back to what I said at the beginning. What we need to be doing now is the same work we have been doing, but more actively, more thoughtfully, and in a more connected way. Another lesson from the history of the queer liberation movement in the United States is that all we have is each other. The simplest, lowest risk way to work towards resistance is to build community. Get to know your neighbors, both geographically and positionally. Find common ground with folks doing work with similar goals, even if you're not 100% aligned in every aspect. Look for opportunities to both speak up for and listen quietly to those under the most direct threat from the state, and wield whatever power you have in solidarity with those who have less or soon will. These small acts of connection, community, and solidarity build the foundation of our interconnected movements, which enables larger scale organizing for all of us. So I just want to close with the words of artist Micah Bazant, which have really become guiding tenets of my work and my organization's work over the last several years, which is there's no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us.
I feel like what I was planning to do is basically echo each of those points, but in the context of prison abolition. So yeah, my name's Jonathan. I'm here on behalf of Free Her Vermont. And yeah, show of hands, are people familiar with Free Her or with the state's plan for new women's prison? Mostly? Yeah, okay. So where that proposal is at right now is for an 158-bed and $70 million investment in a new prison for women in Essex. There are 2 possible sites that the state is currently working on getting zoning permission for. Fortunately, that's like getting bogged down in that process, and our movement is growing and building as it becomes a more localized struggle. But kind of like you were talking about, we can get lost in the urgency. And so I want to kind of take a step back and think about what the prison abolition movement over a long period of time kind of has to teach us about this moment, and also what it kind of demands of us. And so it demands a certain level of militancy, and militancy not necessarily just thinking about like armed struggle, but thinking about that as a discipline and about it as shared convictions in struggle. And not just things that we might think in our heads and then bring to the struggle, but that kind of discipline and conviction that we build through struggle together. Just like incarcerated people are in the belly of the beast, facing the most repression, we are also here in the belly of the capitalist beast, right? And we have a certain level of responsibility, both to people behind the walls and also people across the globe in terms of what our solidarity looks like in that militant struggle. And so we're thinking about solidarity across space. We're also thinking about solidarity across time. And I think a lot of times our movement can get kind of watered down in the demands of what's currently proposed and trying to fight back against that. But the prison abolition struggle in this country really has, most of its roots in like black revolutionary movements in the 1960s and the 1970s, and thinking about the really like capacious and wide revolutionary demands of that moment that then found their way into prison struggles as the prison became like a primary tool of repression against our movements. And so thinking about repression against our movements as we see the rise of fascism again today, it becomes more and more important not just to fight against new prison construction, but to fight for and with the people who are currently incarcerated. And thinking about that, I want to just share one more piece kind of wisdom from incarcerated struggles. Thinking about Russell Maroon Shoatz's words around the dragon and the hydra. So he conceptualized that, and I don't think he was the first to say this, but he's perhaps, one of the most insightful around it. Thinking of the dragon as a very powerful, animal, but only with one head, with one kind of central being. And then the hydra, of course, being a many-headed beast, and when one is sliced off, more appear. And so thinking about movements across time as, the movements that embodied the dragon were very powerful in certain moments, but also perhaps more vulnerable to repression. And movements that embody the hydra as being more varied, more diverse, more nimble. As we face more repression from the right, I think if we embody the hydra, we'll be more powerful, we'll be more resilient, and we'll be more effective. And one part of that is what this movement demands, this moment really demands of us, is a willingness to try things and to support each other. I think often we talk about solidarity, and we think about solidarity, with people who are incarcerated, solidarity with people, in Palestine. And that solidarity, I'm not trying to devalue that, but I'm trying to also expand the idea to solidarity with those who we might not agree with, but who are still trying to take action. And again, kind of coming full circle to this idea of militancy. We don't have to agree with everyone completely, but how are we trying things? How are we kind of striking them in all of the ways they might be trying to strike us, and supporting each other and building solidarity through that, not just fighting with the people who we think we agree with right now. Thank you.
All right, last up. Hi, y'all. Again, my name is Samia. I made the harrowing journey with Jonathan from southern Vermont this evening. I'm really eager to get to the part of this where we hear from y'all. So I just want to name that. I want to keep my comments relatively brief because I think my comrades have made incredible and important points. So just by way of a little bit of a brief sort of self-disclosure, I think I'm coming in here today with my hats of community organizer and organizer for Palestinian liberation. I'm Palestinian American. The majority of my family still lives in Palestine. And so, some of this work of organizing is survival for me. And I imagine there are folks here who understand and feel that. The reason we organize is because we feel that love, that connection to people who are threatened. But I think people have already been doing the hands poll, which I really dig. How many people, how many people here hold an identity of community organizer? Ish. Okay, not very many. How many people here feel like they are part of a community or communities? Multiple. Okay, a little bit more, but not quite as many as I thought. How many people have, in the context of the last few weeks and the time since the election, felt the kind of fear that feels paralyzing and sort of unable to move through? Yeah, rad. So I think if I can add anything tonight, I would like to just add a little bit of what the lessons of Palestinian liberation movement can bring us. And I think there are very real and tangible threats coming down the pike or already present and unfolding related to Trump's presidency and regime, including the HR 9495, the nonprofit killer bill, as well as Project Esther, which is a program of the Heritage Foundation. with deep ties to the ultra-right. And I think folks here have like really eloquently laid out some of those like concrete fears. Another one also being big time threats on campuses to free speech. How many folks here are students at UVM or elsewhere? Okay, cool. Yeah, so like those are very real things, and I think there's a lot to say about them, and maybe they'll come up in discussion and dialogue as we kind of spitball and problem solve together. But I think the seeds of wisdom that I pull from as an organizer, as a Palestinian, and as a person doing solidarity work with many people, types of people, groups, and communities, is, I think, encompassed by a quote from Ghassan Kanafani: "We are a liberation movement fighting for justice," and keeping that kind of at the center. And I see sort of four, as we were driving up here, trying not to swerve on the roads, it's pretty icy. I was thinking about sort of four tenets that I feel like are my guiding principles and come from community organizing work and the groups that I have been organizing with. And one is to be grounded in our assessment of the threats that we face. So some of that is about understanding the real, concrete, tangible threats, and some of that is also being really rigorous and being really disciplined. Jonathan spoke about discipline, like the importance of really trying to understand what are the things that we're facing, so that when we feel that paralyzing fear, we have something to ground us. Things that we know that we can look to, not only as enemies, but also allies. I think the Palestine movement has really been a clarion call for this, because more and more people are seeing the connection between Zionism, imperialism, Western hegemony, and capitalism. And we're seeing that through line. And so my sort of like compassionate call to all of you is to be rigorous in trying to understand how that through line shows up in all of the various ways and places that struggle is happening in the world and in this country. The second thing is to be prepared and know the playbook of fascism, as well as develop our own playbook. That includes really being, again, rigorous about assessing vulnerability in the places where we see threat. And I think I was talking with a group of activists that I organized with last night, and we were lamenting how it would be really rad if there was like a radical person or a group of people that put out like the scenario playbook of this time that we could all use and take back to our communities and be like running scenarios within the networks that we already operate in. Because I think while there are threats to our sort of collective liberation struggles, there are also very specific sort of scenarios that we can be preparing for in the specific communities where we are. The third thing is a framework, a shift that I offer that some people might already be vibing with, which is turning crisis into opportunity. And that is transforming the circumstances that make us feel fear into the fire to keep going and to keep fighting. And the fourth is sort of an internal intention and sort of a reminder of sorts, is that people have built underground in many periods of time through history and currently under immense repression. Palestinians and the Palestinian liberation movement have been, that's my lineage of what I come to from this, and there's a lot of learning that comes directly from Palestinian liberation that can really teach us things. Some folks might be connected to that, but there are many, many, many sort of frameworks for that exist across time and history in queer liberation, in migrant liberation, in all kinds of liberation all around the world. So with those sorts of ideas in mind, my feel is that it's important to bring those questions, bring the questions that we have, and also maybe bring things like those four tenets to any of the networks and all of the communities that we're part of. Regardless of if we're community organizers, we can be thinking and preparing and talking and discussing and being rigorous and being disciplined about this time. And I think it's really what is being called for. And I'll close with a quote from Kanafani. Imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. Thank you.
Well, I want to really thank our speakers. It was a really inspiring and helpful and grounding and orienting collection of comments. So thank you so much for being here. And I do feel like it's exactly the kind of work that we do need to be doing right now, as our speakers have said, based on solidarity, commonality, unity, not giving in to fear, but being grounded and realistic about the threat. So thank you all. As Samia said, we didn't want this to be from the top down. We wanted it to be hearing from people, and then for everybody who's here to themselves participate. So I'm going to open it up now for not only questions, but for comments. Our panelists will get the chance to come in towards the end. So if you have specific questions, they can keep note. But we did want it to be more of a conversation. So feel free to make comments, answer each other, but do remember to try and keep your comments relatively brief, because we have a lot of people in the room, so a couple of minutes. Please start us off.
Background. Background. Computer science, information warfare. Was a faculty member at the Military College of Vermont for 20 years. Have lectured at the United States War College and NATO Counterintelligence, and I want to talk to you about COINTEL, counterintelligence, PSYOP, psychological operations, disinfo, and info. And I will keep it brief. Folks, the enemy is consistently spreading lies. We cannot ignore that. Every one of us facing misinformation, which is a mistake, and disinformation, which is what spews from the mouth of the orange narcissistic sociopath when he breathes. We cannot ignore it, folks. We have to challenge it in our own communities and as broadly as we can. So if you are in social media, it is, and I have a very active Facebook page in which I post # transgender rights, LGBTQ rights, anti-warfare, anti-racism. You take responsibility. Post. Use resources that are credible. For example, Guardian, many other resources that are respectable, that are honest. Don't ignore a lie, ever. We've got to be involved personally. Thank you. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. Yes, green mask, green hat. Sorry, I don't know people's names, so I'm just going to use an objective identification.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Nico. I have a question. I don't know if we are getting questions answered now or what's happening, but I find myself in a constant internal struggle and organizing struggle of what it actually means in practice to balance the urgency as a value of white supremacy and the imminent threat thing, and how do we actually do work from a grounded place while the threats are just sort of coming at us really quickly and all the time, and this broader struggle will probably exist for all of our lifetimes. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that in this moment, maybe from a place of experience over time. That would be valuable to me. That's the whole question.
Thank you. Right behind you, gray hat.
Thank you. If anybody doesn't want to be on film, just say so before they take one. My name is Roshan Namazi. Hi. And one of the things that I found was missing from your panel is that you didn't talk about women. And women are so much a part of the labor movement and of all these movements. And I think one of the things that the Orange Monster has hatred for is women. And I think that you should pay more attention to us and to the cause that the causes which we are in all of these, and we're part of everything. So don't cut us out. Thank you.
Just one point of clarification about the panel is that we did have 2 women lined up who had to pull out at the last minute. Emily, who's a reproductive rights activist, and Rossy from Migrant Justice. So the gender balance was different originally, and both of them, unfortunately, for different individual reasons, couldn't be here. So just let you know that that wasn't intentional.
I'm not worried about the balance of the panel. I was more worried about what you're talking about and the substance of different groups who are marginalized. And we are marginalized as well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Other comments, questions? Go ahead.
I was waiting to be identified as the bald guy over there. I'm Tim Belcher. I'm with the Lawyers Guild and a labor lawyer. In the last month, I've been to, 6 or 10 meetings or discussions about the sort of question that we're talking about here. This was the best. This was the most hopeful. And I just wanted to say that one of the things I've been wrestling with, a lot of people seem to have the same kind of broad concept that we need to organize, we need to sort of get down to the grassroots and get things started. And I haven't heard a lot that's very specific about how that, what's the next step? And so I wanted to throw out 2 things. One was from a panel that I heard online that was talking about the importance of focusing on sheriffs and law enforcement and trying to organize to make, we could be organizing to get our sheriffs in this state to commit to not participate in mass deportations, which I'm suspecting a lot of them are going to be pretty eager to be helping with. So that's one sort of concrete issue I'd throw out there as something that we could organize around. And the other was based on listening to Samia a minute ago, crystallized that really maybe what we need to be thinking about most is just getting out to the communities and teaching people how to protest.
Yep.
Okay? And how to organize, how to engage in civil disobedience, organizing lawyers, organizing legal observers, all of that stuff. And so I just throw that out as a thought for the next steps.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name's Aaron. Just love what you're saying about actually thinking about concrete actions. When we're faced with such evil and converging crises, the destruction of our biosphere, the genocide, the collapse of an empire, it requires us to make very difficult choices about how to proceed. I'm hoping we as humanity can come together and do what's necessary to overcome this evil. And I'm hoping we can do that with love rather than fear and hatred that we've turned to for so long. I think it will require us all to act together. It will require general strikes, general boycotts, not using the fiat system, not allowing them to exercise their power via economic control any longer, and in turn, choosing mutual aid, helping each other, being kind to each other, giving each other what people just need, and choosing differently. So I'm hoping we can do it. This is really inspiring seeing everyone here today, and it's incredibly beautiful. So thanks, everybody. The panel's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Please.
I wanted to thank the gentleman for talking about the police, that we need people in the police to help us. I wish Migrant Justice were here so that we could find out if they are still
being harassed by police, and whether, do you remember, Ashley, a few years ago that we got, or you got, the council in Burlington to get the police to stop identifying and stopping the migrants? Can we get after them again?
The FIP, yeah.
I think Will is from Migrant Justice, so he might want to come back and clarify some of the current situation.
And they won it, I didn't.
Yeah. I was going to say, as much as he would love to take credit for that, there was actually many, many people involved. But very important measure that needs to be defended. Other thoughts, comments, questions, responses?
Maybe we can do a round of answers.
Yeah, if there's no, let me just give the room a moment to breathe. As a teacher, I'm a teacher. Paul.
Hi all, I'm Paul, he, him pronouns. A couple things. I think another reference point for us is what happened with the George Floyd uprisings and the problem that the movement ran into of not having kind of a vision of something beyond the Democratic Party. And if you remember back at the height of the protests, the NBA, there were discussions about going on strike. And kind of all through our history, we've seen like the protests and strikes are infectious, and they lead to people thinking about what I can do. And there was an intervention by Obama and the Democrats with leadership in the NBA Basketball Players Association to turn it to elections. So people talked about some other examples around that, but I think we have to have a North Star of like, we got to keep in mind that we need a workers' party, a labor party, something that's going to offer a longer term alternative. I'm glad that no one brought up the Red State Rebellion because I haven't thought about that, but I think it's really interesting. There's a lot to learn from that because that happened in the midst of ongoing attacks and frustration that nothing was changing. It was teachers, largely led by women, largely not experienced. There were some experienced activists and leaders, but there were thousands of teachers who were not experienced, who were invited into protest and organizing. It wasn't perfect. There were a lot of mistakes, I'm sure, but they had the concept of we need mass action. And our power is in uniting all the teachers and getting community support for that while shutting down schools, right? So I think, for just going forward, a couple thoughts. Like, we need that kind of attitude toward the movement that's going to develop. And I think we might see it more after Trump is in power and the attacks start coming down and more people realize what's happening. So I think we need to be set up for that, to be able to invite people into organizing. Low bar, think about what you can do. But we also need an umbrella because we need movement schools, we need education, we need training, like the civil rights movement, we need freedom schools. So I think part of the umbrella that we can think about setting up are the two things. One, what's the easy entry into activism and organizing for a broad number of people, and we need to be able to educate and train and learn from each other as we go. So we need a container for that of some sort.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really have a question. There's been obviously a whole lot of online meetings sponsored by a variety of organizations, some with a huge social media presence. For example, Indivisible. So they've been organizing their own little groups, or maybe not so little. They're very much, a group that works closely with the Democratic Party. Working Families Party, as well as been organizing their own groups. So everyone is like recruiting to their own thing. and setting up their own group. Surge, standing up for racial justice, is doing the same thing. They're organizing their own little groups, or whatever they call them. And I actually see that as an obstacle. I mean, I think people here understand the importance of some kind of a broad, united front. And I don't want us to paint ourselves into a corner where just people with the proper leftist credentials and ideology self-isolate. Somehow we're going to have to be able to work with people who still believe that the answer is going to be in 2026 or 2028 when we're going to elect another centrist or right centrist Democrat. But we have to work with them to build a mass movement. And I'd like to hear more reflections on how we can actually do that. And I'm also rather pissed off that all these organizations right now, what their big thing is recruiting to their getting membership and dues dollars in, which I just think is incredibly sectarian. Sectarianism by Democratic Party groups, but whatever.
Thanks. Go ahead. Bob, do you have a hand? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Barb. Just two practical things that I've been thinking about a lot is that it feels like right now there is a vast number of people who would like to volunteer and get involved in something, and they don't know how to start or where to begin.
Yep.
And then there's another large group of people who have been involved in a variety of issues, their own issue, something that's important to them, that is willing to do some things to help other groups that haven't been the groups that they've historically worked with or volunteered with or organized with. And that we need to figure out a way to build capacity so that that kind of intent for doing more that I see a bit floundering, well-intentioned floundering towards doing more but not knowing how to. We need to develop pathways in and shared information between groups so that it is easier and low barrier because the potential to do more, at least in Vermont, is quite high, and the practical ways to get from here to there, I think, are not clear, and it'd be great if some folks figured out how to do that. Ashley.
Great, thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to let the panelists come back because there are several threads and questions hanging, and I'm sure that people on the panel will have things that they want to say, so maybe in the direction that we started with.
Sure. First, I'm happy that every group is growing. I want everybody to grow as fast as possible, and that's a good thing. What we do with those groups together is the key question, because that's where magic happens. If people are building little silos separate and apart from one another, that's a disaster. That's auto divide and conquer. What everybody needs to do is build their group and then unite and fight together in a common project. So, let's not dismiss anybody trying to build their group. I wanted to come back to Nico's question about urgency and grounding, because I think it's a big question, because I think all of us are like, oh my God, what are we going to face in January? And oh my God, I can't just walk around terrified all the time. What am I going to do with it? And I have a couple of different answers. One, analytical. We need to understand our enemy better than they understand their enemy. And that's important with Donald Trump, because often I'm not sure if he understands himself, because he's a mental chaos when you look at when he speaks. But analytically, what are they up to? And so understanding that in a greater detail is very empowering, because then you can figure out what their line of attack is and how we can respond to it. And just remembering they don't have a majority. It's really important, because I think a lot of people after the election were like, oh my God, we live in a right-wing lunatic asylum called the United States of America. How could this happen a second time? But remember, he got 33% of the electorate. We are 66%. Many who didn't even vote. 46%, 36% didn't come out and vote. And a lot of those people don't like either party, and they're deeply disaffected with the status quo. So just remember, we are many, Trump has few. So just that fundamental confidence. And then I think having some grounding values really helps. Number one for this moment To deal with Trump's divide and conquer is solidarity, that an injury to one is an injury to all. Anybody attacked, all of us are attacked. The first line of attack is the first line of defense. When they come for anybody, we have to be there for them. Even if we disagree with them, anybody is under attack, we're with them. Then having a strategy, and this is where it gets more concrete in the way Barb was beginning to ask about. Having a strategy that is, we need to build mass organization with easy entry points so that everybody can become an activist right away without 50 years of training, without 4 months of training or whatever. Find a way open to get people involved. Because I think a lot of people, I know I was talking to an activist in the VCPL, in the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation. Her little mother's group, parents group, which has come together for their disabled kids, they're having a conversation about how they build resistance to Trump. You know, like that, there's a conversation happening everywhere about how to respond. So opening up organizations so that people can find a way in. New coalitions, new mass formations are the key. And then mass action. We cannot stop this in little actions. We can't stop it with lobbying. We can't stop it in the immediate with any kind of voting, because they're in power right now and they're coming for us. And then having some strategies. I think what Will laid out for migrant justice is a model. Clear strategic points. Defend the FIP, emergency response networks to respond to deportation threats, and then defense of workers' rights on the job. Migrant Justice has a clear idea, because they've been doing this forever in a more sophisticated way than almost any other movement in the state. So we have a lot to learn from them, and hopefully when we organize a big teach-in about all this stuff, they can do classes on how they built their organization that can teach other groups. Another example is the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation. We have a strategic priority of passing ballot measures for apartheid-free, which then sets up boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we're doing this in lots of little towns across the state, which is an educative role, it's a political battle, and it sets the groundwork for longer-term organizing. Final point is, I think in the blue states, we have an enormous opportunity that's different than the red state. Red states are the red state teachers revolt. Here in the blue states, we can say to our government, you're nominally opposed to Trump. What are you going to do about it? Because if you look at what the Democrats, all their strategy discussions are legal, good luck with that with the Supreme Court. Or get ready for 2026 and 2028. By that time, tens of thousands of people are going to get deported and been laid off. That's a no-win strategy. So with the Democrats in the State House, we have to say, defend the FIP, the fairness and impartial policing policy. Uphold our constitutional defense in Vermont for abortion rights. Defend medicine abortion, telemedical abortions that people can provide from Vermont. Defend public sector workers. They're going to say layoffs of all public sectors. You've got to find the money by taxing the rich in this state to keep people in their jobs, in defiance of the federal government. And you can just go down the list of the demands that organically come out of the issues that we're involved in. Apartheid free, why not? This is going to be the second most Zionist presidency after Joe Biden's in US history. So what about Vermont becoming an apartheid free state and divesting from everything in Israel? So I think we need to have a coming together of organizations, with which the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation has put out a call, and we're meeting on Thursday, and if you're in an organization, come talk to me afterwards, because we are trying to bring all the silos together for common planning and organizing, so we're not just little bitty struggles separate from one another, but a much, much stronger and united Hydra.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we could also do reverse order so that folks who.
That's a good idea. No,
Okay. Then. Yeah, thanks very much, everybody, for comments and questions. Echoing a lot of what Ashley said. I'll talk a little bit more about the role of policing under the Trump administration. I spoke about this in my initial remarks. But it seems like there were a couple questions, so I'll repeat myself a little bit with folks' permission and give a little bit more background, because I know I was speaking quickly. Migrant Justice is responsible for leading a fight over the past 12 years to create a framework in Vermont called Fair and Impartial Policing Policies, sometimes abbreviated as FIPP or FIP. When people in the country talk about sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, this is what they're talking about. We tend to avoid that language because it's vague, it's sort of an empty signifier. There's nothing coherent about what sanctuary means, and it oftentimes gives the misimpression for people that ICE or Border Patrol would be prohibited from operating within a particular jurisdiction, which doesn't and can't happen. But what can happen is that jurisdictions can ensure that their law enforcement agencies will not be involved in immigration enforcement. And that's what migrant justice has won in Vermont. So every agency in the state, at the state, local, and also at the county sheriff level, is required by law to implement a fair and impartial policing policy. This has to be based at a minimum on a statewide model that migrant justice has written many of the provisions and has negotiated over the years. So this policy prohibits any cop in the state from asking about immigration status, from prolonging a detention to investigate immigration status, to being involved in civil immigration enforcement. That means that they can't support raids, they can't support ICE or Border Patrol checkpoints. If ICE or Border Patrol calls them to the scene of an immigration arrest, they aren't allowed to respond, and it prohibits them in most cases from communicating information with ICE or Border Patrol about people with whom they're in contact. That policy came under attack in 2017, and law enforcement agencies and state elected officials responded by watering down the policy and adding new loopholes into Vermont's FIP. That was in response to direct threats from Jeff Sessions' Department of Justice, threatening to pull funds from law enforcement agencies that wouldn't certify their compliance with Trump's immigration policies. It took us 7 years to negotiate back many of the provisions that had been lost in 2017, but migrant justice was successful in doing so. And in April of 2024, the state implemented a strengthened fair and impartial policing policy that includes the protections that I just mentioned. Policy on paper is one thing, practice is another. So it is incredibly important that we are vigilant to ensure that officers are held accountable to violations of the policy. There are a couple different avenues to do that under Vermont law, and there have been immigrants who have been discriminated against by cops who have involved immigration enforcement, and they have been successful in having a redress of their rights and getting the cops to pay them out money in several circumstances. We can have more one-on-one conversations if there are any remaining questions about the FIPs, but I just sort of want to provide that additional information. So we are very fortunate to have this history of struggle in Vermont, which means that we have these policies in place with Trump coming in. Again, we know that the threats that came in 2017 to pull funding are going to happen again, and they're going to be stronger this time around. So that's why we need to be ready to mobilize when those threats come, to fight back strongly, to make sure that Vermont elected officials and that law enforcement agencies do not water down the policy, and ensure that officers are being held accountable to that policy. So that's just a couple things about policing and as regards to immigration. And then there's a question about volunteering. Tim's a lawyer. Maybe there's other lawyers in the room. If you're a lawyer, talk to Barb before you leave. Barb is recruiting attorneys right now to work on family preparedness plans. This is incredibly important. People who are parents and who are at risk of immigration detention are filling out family preparedness plans in order to assign temporary emergency custody of their kids in the case of detention or deportation. There's a whole lot of work happening around that, and that Barb is spearheading on the legal side. So thank you, Barb, and please reach out. And there's a lot more I could say about volunteering, but I think I'll pause there, and then we can sort of come back to it at the end if there are sort of like calls to action at the end.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on one thing? And I have signed up with Barb. But the point I was trying to get to about the policing issue was I'm trying to find a fight we can pick at the local level. And the way you describe it, it sounds a little bit like we've got it all under control, and I'm pretty sure that's probably not right. If there is an organizing opportunity at the local level to march on the sheriff or do something, how would you frame, I mean, do you see that kind of opportunity? Is there something we could all be doing just if we need to find something to do?
We're going to see.
I don't think there's going to be a lack of things to do, but yeah, great question. And yeah, so I think there are sort of two scenarios. One, if and when elected officials and law enforcement agencies start to make noise about watering down or taking away the FIPs under threats from Trump's Department of Justice, that will be a mobilizing opportunity.
Yeah, in Chicago. Yeah, they're threatening.
In Vermont, we have Fed passed in Richmond, and now they want to cancel it and bring another language to Fed based on the state because it doesn't meet the federal laws, their excuse. So it's happening, but in different ways.
Yeah, not being canceled in Richmond. There is a there is an update in language that we're talking with.
But for the chief of police, I'm not going to work with this. I am under pressure to work with something else, and the something else you will translate it in different ways.
Yeah. And then I think the second mobilizing opportunity will be if and when there are instances of collaboration and violations of the policy. And that has happened over the years, and it's occasioned protests and rallies, whether it results in somebody's detention or another violation of their rights. There have been actions at the Chittenden County Sheriff's, at Franklin County Sheriff's. Orleans County is shaping up to be, Essex County is shaping up to be the real enemy on this. They're threatening non-compliance with the FIP, and that sheriff's office will be, I think, the principal one to watch in the coming years.
We're not going in reverse, because I didn't think of that in time. It's too confusing now to turn around. So.
Right. I'll try and keep my closing remarks brief, just because I think that there's already been a lot of great discussion. But I did want to return to that question about the Red State Teachers Revolt and build off a little bit of the points that Paul made, because I kind of needed to mention that there in the end, and reference it. But I think that it is important for us to understand that as inspiring as that instance was, I think Paul brought up the fact it was very messy.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. That we shouldn't try and hide. And despite some, initial victories, there were many pockets in which the Red State Teachers Revolt, happened and resistance occurred in which they did not win all of their demands. And I would encourage folks to kind of go back and read a lot of what was written at the time. There's actually a very good book by that same name of Red State Teachers Revolt, written by Eric LeBlanc. That folks could reference. But I only say that because I think that for a couple of things. One is, despite how messy it was still incredibly inspiring. I mean, these were teachers, many of whom had never organized before in their life, that were simply compelled by the attacks that they were facing, were compelled to resist, were compelled to start organizing, and they were flying by the seat of their pants while they were doing it. And that is both terrifying and incredibly inspiring all at the same time. I mean, we are talking about these impromptu Facebook groups forming of hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers that starting to coordinate, and these committees getting together and just going. And as inspiring as that is, the more that we can be prepared ahead of time, the better we're going to be, right? So, as spontaneous, the spontaneity is both beautiful, but also, if we can avoid that, let's do, right? Like let's be more prepared, ahead of time. And so, and part of that is going back and learning that history, seeing what they did that we want to repeat, seeing what they did that we want to avoid, right? There's so many lessons to learn. But I think that, there's going to be a lot of struggle in the next coming 4 years, and let's be honest, well beyond the next 4 years. And there's going to be a lot of victories, and there's going to be a lot of defeats. I think we are going to be entering into a time of serious whiplash, of incredibly inspiring victories and some soul-crushing defeats. But all of those things are going to be the crucible of, through which, the fire that we go through, that is going to ideally produce an entire generation of seasoned activists, right? That have made mistakes and experienced defeats from those mistakes, and now come out more experienced, better prepared, better able to organize, better able to fight. And so I think it's just really important that we both look to learn from the past experiences, but then also go through knowing that, unfortunately, the left has been largely crushed in this country since the 80s. And so in a lot of ways, we're kind of getting our feet back underneath us for the first time. And so that's going to mean that, mistakes are going to get made. And that is not the end of the world. Those are, learning experiences in which we can all come back as more seasoned activists, better trained, better prepared for the fights that are going to be coming in the future. And so I hope that we're prepared for those ups and downs and to be able to build that solidarity together. Thanks, everyone.
Actually, we don't have anything that hasn't been very well said by other folks already, so I don't believe in talking just for the sake of talking.
Was there a hand?
Go ahead, John.
There's a request for the microphone.
I'm Jordan, first generation Bosnian diaspora, born and raised in Vermont, involved with the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation. And speaking about the political dynamics in the U.S., we have witnessed the utter moral and intellectual bankruptcy of our two-party dictatorship and the inefficacy of the political system we have here in the U.S. And it's creating space for us to build a political movement that's reflective of the majority of the people here. We do have political organizations that currently exist, such as the DSA, CPUSA, PSL, et cetera, et cetera. However, many were conditioned that these alternative political organizations that we have already available to us are not acceptable and antithetical to democracy, when in fact is the exact opposite. So we do have the challenge of deprogramming and educating on the truth about these political organizations, including their history. And we also have the challenge of forming a unified solidarity party that will combine all the progressive elements within the U.S. And there's no better place to start than right here in Vermont. Vermont is the lab in the U.S. We must not take that fact for granted.
So, after what you shared, I'm like, man, do I really have something to say?
Speak, Jonathan.
No, I think what's coming to mind for me is people who are living without shelter right now. And like, I'm hearing these questions about, you know, where do we find the struggle? And like, where can we be in like movement together? And I think that struggle is everywhere in our state and in our communities. And I could be wrong, but the last number that I saw was that 7 people had passed away in the last week or so, because they were living, you know, without a home. And so I think that's, I want to name that for us, that this is, you know, this isn't just something that's coming in January, this is something that's here. And it's also, you know, like different people have talked about, like, this is something that any of us can act on. Make a pot of chili, go hang out on the street, you know, like there are ways to act immediately. And also, then the other thing to me is also thinking about like beginnings, and thinking about like connecting with liberals or other folks to try to like broaden our movements. I think where we start the story matters. You know, I think we've seen that most clearly in the case of Palestine. If the story starts, you know, October 7th, if it starts 1948, if it starts, you know, hundreds of years ago. And similarly, you know, with homelessness right now in Vermont, does that story start with the rollback of the motel program? Does it start, you know, a decade ago? Does it start with like the eugenics movement and a certain type of Vermont for a certain type of Vermonter? And we talk about that a lot with like the prison movement. You know, this doesn't start with like allegations of misconduct at CRCF in 2019, you know, taking this back further and further and doing that deep kind of like political education and movement building that then demands a certain kind of solidarity, a certain kind of action that I think can help us build our movements.
Yeah, I think, thanks y'all. Thanks for the really awesome questions. I think the only thing I want to add is like lifting up something that Kali Akuno, who's one of the keynote speakers at the conference for Palestine that happened in October, said is like, if you, like, you don't have to look far in your communities to find places to plug in. And I think I'm obviously just riffing off everything you're saying, sorry. But I think that is important. It's important because the feeling of not knowing how to kind of combat that sense of urgency was put in us. That is like white supremacy culture. That's a heritage that we all have to live with. And the term that I think a lot about is like unlearning, undoing a lot of the things that these systems have deposited into us so that we can turn towards something new and create space. And that I don't mean that in like a lofty way. I mean that in like a real sort of like read some stuff way. Like there's like good work out there from Palestinian liberation thinkers, from Black Marxists, from abolitionists who give us a lot of answers. And I tend to believe that our communities have what we need. It's just a matter of finding the ways to connect it. So that's the note I want to end on. Thank you all.
Thank you again, and thank you all. As we said, like finish around 7:30, but we do have a little bit of time if people want to, and I hope people do connect informally and network. And I know that there are all sorts of upcoming events that people should share. If you didn't sign in at the beginning, if you came in late, there is a sign-in sheet if you want to find out about more events that Tempest is going to be hosting in the upcoming period. But thank you all, and as the panelists have said, don't give in to the fear. Stay connected. Remember that an injury to one is an injury to all. And let's be really smart about developing very effective organizing strategies to cope with the upcoming period. Stay strong, everyone.